be advised that this recorded webinar has been edited from its original format, which may have included a product demo. To set up a live demo or to request more information, please complete the form to the right. Or if you are currently not on CSC Global, there is a link to the website in the description of this video. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, AML-KYC Compliance Considerations for Private Capital Fund Managers. My name is Christy DeMeo-Ziegler from the CSC webinar team. Right now, I do have the pleasure of introducing Karen Walsh, the National Director of Financial Executives Alliance. Karen?
Thank you, Christy. And as Christy just said, my name is Karen Walsh, National Director of the FEA. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, and thanks CSC Global and PEF for hosting this discussion and providing CPE credit for our live viewers. If you're not yet a member of the FEA, please take a moment to register, feaai.com. Membership is complimentary and is intended for senior financial executives of alternative investment firms. As a reminder, the views expressed in this webinar are the views of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect the view of First Republic Bank, its subsidiaries, or the FEA. With that, I'd like to introduce our moderator and one of our founding FEA New York PE board members, Rob Jackowitz. Rob is a partner and the CFO of both Bay Pine and Declaration Partners, which he joined in April 2018. He has more than 30 years of financial and investment management experience, including 25 years in the alternative assets industry in a CFO role. From 2007 to 2018, he was a partner of Pinebrook Partners, a New York-based growth equity firm with more than $6 billion AUMs, where he served in the capacity of CFO, COO, and CCO. Rob attended the George Washington University and New York University. He's a certified public accountant and currently serves on the board of Stewart Partners, as well as I mentioned, the New York Regional Board of the Financial Executives Alliance. Take it away, Rob.
Thanks so much, Karen. I appreciate it. And welcome to all the fellow board members. Great to have you today. I think we've got a nice program scheduled. First and foremost, let me take an opportunity to introduce our panelists. So let me start. I'm going to start with Charlene Ellis. Charlene oversees CSC's U.S. Fund Services, Investor Services, Compliance, and General Operations, including client onboarding. She's been with CSC Global Financial Markets, or joined them in 2020, brings more than 15 years of deep industry knowledge and experience in the alternative investment space, with proven ability to drive results, regulatory compliance management, and large-scale implementations. In addition, we've got two members from First Republic Bank with us. First is Cindy Engelbrecht. Cindy's responsible for managing a team of compliance professionals to maintain and administer the bank-wide BSA AML program. Her previous roles include Vice President of Regulatory Compliance at Union Bank, Bank Examiner at Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, and Associate Bank Examiner at the U.S. Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. And in addition, we've got Jared Barnes, also from First Republic. Jared is responsible for managing financial intelligence, customer due diligence, and currency transaction reporting operations. Jared has extensive experience in AML, sanctions, and fraud compliance risk management practices, and participates in First Republic Bank's major initiatives as a subject matter expert. Pardon me. But the agenda for today is the 6 pillars of AML-KYC readiness, which covers the establishment of internal AML and KYC policies, procedures, and controls, establish compliance and/or MLRO officers for oversight and escalation, establish a firm customer due diligence program, effective risk-based evaluations and enhanced due diligence, educate and train, and of course, continue screening and monitoring and maintain accurate records of actions taken.
So Rob, I can jump in here to go over the 6 pillars of the AML-KYC program.
Oh, great, Charlene. Thank you.
You're welcome. So welcome, everyone. So as Rob stated, the first part of our webinar is to just cover the 6 pillars of AML-KYC program. So historically, institutional anti-money laundering and know your customer compliance program have always been based on the 5 pillars: internal policies and procedures, designation of an AML-KYC officer, employee training, implementation, independent testing, and customer due diligence. However, as we were working to prepare an anti-money laundering and KYC guide for private fund managers, we wanted to expand on some of the vulnerabilities that are often overlooked in a KYC program by placing more emphasis on these critical processes. The objective here is to capture the spirit of the law and not just the letter of the law. Whether or not we are preparing ourselves to be proactive, preventative, and not only just reactionary. So therefore, we expanded the 5 pillars to 6 by extracting what we believe to be one of the most overlooked and least risk mitigated exposures for fund managers. So with that said, I'll go through those 6 pillars, and of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop those questions in the question Q&A box, and we'll get to them as we get through the webinar. So the first is to establish internal AML KYC policies and procedures and controls. These procedures should be documented. They should be accessible by every member of your team as they work through any AML and KYC processes. They should include all of the reporting and escalation processes for your employees, as well as designate who those reporting channels and escalation channels should be. It is important that these procedures are evaluated periodically. Periodically implies a frequency of at least annually to just make sure that your procedures are up to date with changes in any regulatory compliance requirements, as well as just making sure that they're relevant as your business expands and your needs expand. With the complexity of different investment strategies and the complexities of new investors being opened in the market to invest in these various fund products, you want to make sure that your procedures are relevant and that they are active. If they are not relevant, they're not active, they're really not able to help you discern and able to properly mitigate your risk exposure when it comes to AML and KYC policies and procedures. The next pillar is establishing an anti-money laundering officer or compliance officer. This individual normally oversees your AML and KYC program. They should be very much experienced in AML and KYC regulatory requirements and any legal requirements that is a result of changes within the industry that impacts your business. Your AML and money laundering officer would be the individual that would review any high risk or any ambiguous transactions that arise during the normal review of your AML and KYC transactions. And they're the ones that are going to be able to provide the guidance. They're also the individuals that would normally do any sort of reporting that is necessary to any of the regulatory bodies resulting from a high-risk transaction or vulnerable transactions to the organization. It is imperative that your AML officer is continuing their education and continuing to expand on their knowledge and stay abreast of changes as they occur. One of the risk exposures you have with not having continued education and not being able to stay abreast of changes as they occur in the market is having stale dated procedures. Your AML officer should be reviewing these procedures, making sure that they're up to date, and then should be able to provide guidance, direction, and support to all of your employees as they go through their day-to-day processing for any sort of AML and KYC transactions. The third pillar is to establish a customer due diligence program, also known as a customer identification program. And this allows you to be able to identify those that are investing into your fund products and ensuring that you have made the designated steps, or taken the designated steps, I should say, to ensure that these individuals are who they say they are. In establishing your customer due diligence program, it does require that we go beyond just having the investor complete a subscription application or a purchase agreement for one of your investments. It does require that we collect certain identification documents to be able to establish the identity of the investor, and being able also to do any look-through provisions for any other parties that are involved with the investor or that the investors are involved in that may create an opportunity of risk exposure for the firm. If the investor is an individual, it is necessary to collect identification documents such as driver's license, passport, address verifications, etc. If the party is an entity, it is necessary to make sure that we collect information regarding the purpose of the business, the formation of the business, the registered business address, as well as any party that is an underlying beneficial owner, owning 25% or more, or any party that has the authority to direct and make investment decisions for the entity. It is also critical to establish all banking relationships and financial institution relationships that these investors have, because being able to identify those relationships create the transparency needed in order to properly identify high-risk transactions. It's not simply just making sure that you collect the information, but you also must screen the information. Utilizing a third-party screening vendor such as Refinitiv WorldCheck or LexisNexis would allow you to then run these names according to, through their databases to see if there's any affiliations for politically exposed persons, anyone that has affiliations with any of the U.S. sanction lists, so OFAC, or the UK sanction list, or any of the other sanction lists for all of the other jurisdictions. Be able to also identify negative news, see if there's any affiliations with bad actors, and if there were any previous regulatory violations that you should be aware of. Your program should be able to identify and screen for all of these matters, because you should be able to properly investigate them to see whether or not there is any exposure to the investor, to the firm, or to your business with continuing to transact and do business with this individual. In capturing your customer due diligence program, it is also essential to make sure that the information is maintained and safeguarded for privacy and for privacy purposes. You will be collecting information that are personally identifiable information, and you want to make sure that that information is safeguarded. It is not accessible to anyone and parties that actually need to be able to review this document to make a determination as to the risk associated with continuing this relationship. The fourth pillar that we wanted to discuss is an effective risk-based evaluation and enhanced due diligence. One of the primary components of the pillars is ensuring that you have a risk-based program. That means that you should be able to determine the risk associated with any particular transaction, any particular client, or any particular investment. Having this risk-based approach allows you to, one, focus heavily on those items that are of higher risk, where your resources will be put more to those particular transactions, those particular activities and investors, to be able to identify for the risk appetite of your firm whether or not you want to continue with this transaction. It is imperative that these risk-based evaluation programs be properly documented and not necessarily abstract, meaning that they are based on static procedures or algorithms that could be applied consistently and unilaterally across your accounts and transactions. It is effective if these algorithms are documented within a technology system, or if they are documented with a formula-based approach, where based on certain criteria and a particular risk assignment is assigned to a particular account. And that assignment could be on a number scale. So from 1 to 10 example is low, 15 to 25 is medium, everything over 40 is high. And again, that's just really just abstract numbers. You would actually design them specifically for your firm. The idea is to be able to measure the risk with a particular account as low, medium, or high. What you want to do is focus all of your efforts, or predominantly most of your efforts, on those accounts that flag in the medium and high risk categories. And it's also essential that there be consistency of the application of this formula, meaning that if you apply like accounts with like characteristics, the same risk-based evaluation result would actually be what is found in your risk program. If one account presents as A and a similar account presents as B, that means that your risk evaluation and your risk-based program is not properly and effectively mitigated to be able to provide a sound risk association that you can rely on. So it is important that when you are looking at your risk-based approach, that you're making sure that when consistently applied, consistent results are being received for liked accounts. If you have a medium or high risk account, depending on your appetite for your firm, you may want to refer those accounts to your anti-money laundering officer to be able to review and provide guidance to your team as to whether or not these accounts should be flagged, their assets should be frozen, or whether or not they should be cleared for transactions, whether or not they're cleared for additional review, or they are cleared for business as usual. What we want to make sure that we are accomplishing here is that we are able to ensure that we are tackling suspicious activity, that when we identify an account as high risk, that our procedures are robust enough to ensure that proper due diligence is applied to these high-risk accounts. Are they to be flagged and these assets to be frozen? Should the transactions be then deemed unprocessable so that you do not continue with the relationship that's associated with the transaction? And whether or not any reporting is necessary to the regulatory bodies based on the risk that you have associated with the account. Sometimes these risks that you may assign may not simply be just because the account indeed is flagged as a sanctioned account or as an account that is involved in any anti-money laundering activities, or money laundering activities, I should say, but it could be an account where the risk appetite just exceeds your comfortability of your firm. So while the transaction itself is high risk, it may not necessarily violate the law. Your firm may choose to disengage with those transactions because they're just not comfortable with the risk exposure of certain high-risk transactions. So having that risk-based program allows you to be able to properly decision accounts as they arise and make the decisions that fits best with your firm's risk appetite, or those decisions that requires actions because they are truly a violation of a particular regulatory law or regulatory guidelines. And also with your risk evaluation program, it is also necessary to make sure that all of your procedures, all of your action steps in handling high-risk accounts are properly documented. They are properly escalated and reviewed by your internal compliance and legal teams where applicable, and that they're stored and readily available for review should the need arise for additional review by an external regulatory firm or your internal audit team. The next pillar is educate and train. It is essential to make sure that you are properly educating your teams and training them on your anti-money laundering and KYC policies. It's important that this training is done on a continuous basis. Most efficiently is to make sure that this training is done annually. And it's efficient to make sure that when you are doing the training, that there is a sound understanding by the recipients as to their responsibilities to the firm's procedures and policies. It is effective to make sure that when you are executing this training, that you have a way to evaluate that your team has comprehended the information that has been conveyed to them, and they're able to properly apply it to their day-to-day practices. Usually that is the result of actually having an assessment being done at the end of these trainings, or it also is essential to possibly have the client, or I'm sorry, your team actually go through exercises where they're applying the procedures and policies to transactions that they encounter in their day-to-day, and the result of that application is what is expected as a part of your procedure. It is essential that you keep an outline and you document all of the attendees that attended the training, that you document when the training was actually administered, and that as changes come through, that your procedures, you have the ability to go through that education and training again. So that training should be robust enough to actually be executed upon demand. So you should have a process that as new employees join the firm, they are able to go through this training upon their introduction and onboarding to the firm. You should have your training should be robust enough to be able to accommodate for changes in the market. So whether that is simply just communication updates, advising of these changes while you update your procedures to incorporate these changes for your annual delivery of this training, your procedures and your continued education of your team should be flexible. It should not be stringent in the fact that it can only be administered annually, and it can only be, and it has no flexibility to be modified as things change in the market. The sixth pillar is just going into just continuing screening and monitoring. And one of the things that we noticed from the polls is that 30% of the recipients stated that they screen investors upon onboarding. And that might be sufficient to make sure that you are not entering any transaction with any parties that has illicit affiliations or has transactions that may be deemed a violation of the Money Laundering Act or a violation of the BSA. It is not necessarily where your process needs to stop. And that is because an individual's association assignments and their business dealings can change over time. And so you want to make sure that you are continually monitoring accounts, that you're continually screening investors, their underlying beneficial owners, all associated parties, to capture any changes in behaviors, changes in affiliations that may now deem the account to be high risk. We find that this is one of the most overlooked and least mitigated steps of a due diligence program, which is why we extracted it out to be its own standalone process. And that is because as changes occur, if you are not implementing a way to be able to mitigate, capture, and proactively review these changes, you can find yourself having accounts on your books that are indeed risk exposure to you, to your investors, as well as to your ongoing business strategy. A perfect example of that is, as we look at what's going on in Europe with Russia and Ukraine. We're seeing new sanctions come through from the U.S., from the UN, and from the UK with regards to Russian-affiliated entities, parties, banks, etc. And your program needs to be able to screen for these changes as they come through. If you're only doing your screening at the stage of onboarding, should someone appear on a sanctions list post that onboarding, you have no way of qualifying, quantifying, or validating that this account should no longer be transacted with. So it's important that you have a continued and ongoing due diligence program, that you are continually screening for investors. You can do that periodically, whether it's quarterly, annually, or semi-annually. The idea here is to make sure that you are reviewing your accounts. You are reviewing them and screening them as changes occur in the market, so you can stay abreast of these changes. If you do not have a way to do so, you are leaving yourself open to possibly having high-risk accounts on your books and in your business that exposes not only your firm but exposes your other investors. And what we find in doing so is that risk exposure is never worth not properly reviewing and screening these accounts. They can result in reputation risks, they can result in fines, they can result in the discontinuation of your operations. So having that ongoing screening is essential. And we find that in the private capital markets that is not something that's highly regarded or something that's that is taken into consideration when we're doing the program. It's usually just making sure that you have done that in the initial intake. And the final step with that is also making sure that when you are screening these accounts, that you're not just screening them against OFAC. There's so many other sanction lists that are out there regarding all kinds of jurisdictions. There are PEP screenings that need to be done. There are bad actors screenings that need to be done, meaning that there are affiliations with individuals that have been, convicted of a criminal transaction in the past or present ongoing, current criminal proceedings. If you're simply just scanning against OFAC, you're not going to be able to identify these other areas of risk that are potentially dangerous to your firm. So it's essential that your risk ongoing screening be holistic, not just to be limited to OFAC screening, but be able to look at every part of the transaction that is exposed to illicit behaviors, illicit parties, and making sure that you have a catch-all for that. So with that said, that covers the 6 pillars. I'll turn it back over to Rob so that he can continue with the additional items in the webinar.
That's super helpful, Charlene. That's really great information for everyone. So thank you. And I know I had skipped ahead a little bit, so apologies for that. I had moved on to the frequency, so we're going to pick up there. And I think you were making reference to ongoing risk mitigation and how important that is, especially in light of current geopolitical issues. So I think many of the CFOs and other participants on this call are going to take that to heart, given those ongoing changes. And I think it certainly magnifies the importance of doing these risk assessments, on a continuous basis, periodically, and not just when onboarding investors. So moving on to our next topic, or I should say our next slide, is the investment advisor's role and compliance considerations under the AML Act of 2020.
So before I start, I'm going to reiterate what Shailene said, and I love those 2 points. One is the consideration for the spirit of the law and not just the letter of the law, and I'll explain that later with my presentation. And the other thing is being proactive, not reactive. And I feel that this group is here today because we're trying to be proactive. Changes are definitely coming with the new administration and the AML Act of 2020. Investment advisors actually have a very unique position to partner with their banks too, to help U.S. government fight against money laundering and terrorist financing, and also sanctions evasion. In the slide, we talk a little bit about heightened scrutiny and some attention from the regulators, starting from 2020 with FBI publishing some of the gaps within this industry because it's not formally regulated or formally subject to AML program. So in that report, actually, there are 3 examples of hedge fund and private equity firm facilitating hundreds of millions of dollars for the illicit actors from Russia and from cybercrime and some other activities. In addition to that, there is a strong call for Biden administration to resurrect and refine the FinCEN 2015 proposed rules for investment advisors to comply with AML rules, just like other financial institutions. And also our mutual evaluation from Financial Action Task Force highlighted that there is definitely a gap in this industry. So with that, I'd like to go over the summary of the AML 2020. I'm not going to cover all of them, but I think there are a couple of the provisions that are applicable to our business partners here. One is the creation of beneficial ownership database. I'm sure you heard about this. It's very similar to the customer due diligence rules that was finalized back in 2018 for financial institutions. And I'm also certain that you know about the COBO requirement or certificate of beneficial ownership information that you have to provide to your bankers if you have certain ownership threshold. But the difference is this is actually targeting the reporting companies, not the banks. So that could be our business partners here. And what I mean by that is in the past with CDD rules, customer due diligence rules, there was some distinct exemptions for pooled funds. And so if it's pooled funds, then maybe you don't need to provide UBO. Whereas this one may define it as exemption for only funds that are managed by registered investment advisors. So you may be impacted by this rule where you have to submit your beneficial ownership information and continue to update as the rule is finalized. And the deadline for this is, so if you're an existing company and you're subject to this rule, then you have 1 year from the final rule to provide that information. And it's very similar to what you provide today to the banks, where you would give UBO information, ultimate beneficial ownership information with their name, address, and some other CIP information, customer identifying information. And then the next one is actually the whistleblower program. I'm sure you're used to seeing whistleblower program for different types of things, like the SEC has their whistleblower program, and then also Sarbanes-Oxley has it to report out some of the fraudulent activity at the banks. But this is specific to the money laundering violation at your organization. So for example, if your employee feels like there's some things that you're doing that's violating money laundering or sanctions laws, even though you're not directly subject to it, that person may take it outside of your organization and report it to the regulatory agency. And because they're expanding the monetary reward, it incentivizes your employees to take this information out, and if there's enforcement action against your entity, they pay 30% of that amount. And so for us, particularly banks, we have to address this and make sure that we have escalation points where employees could go to their managers or their anonymous hotline and report it and resolve it there before it gets further to the regulatory agencies. So those are two areas where you may consider implementing right away and apply those. The other thing I like to talk about is a little bit of what you might want to consider as these changes are happening. If you have AML program already, you might look at it and take Shailene's advice and make it risk-based, meaning it's appropriate for the type of risk that you're willing to take. For example, if you're just a domestic fund and taking on domestic investors, that's probably not as risky as if you have international investors and funds. And so those are things that you would want to consider to make sure that you're prepared and to address risks. And then the other thing is, if you're outsourcing your AML program, make sure you do due diligence on the third-party service provider. Don't just take their word for it that they have AML program and they're covering for you, but I think you're also responsible for understanding how are you executing against the program. So for example, if your third-party service provider says, I'm doing sanction screening for you, you might want to know what kind of lists are you using to screen my investors, and how are you escalating if there is a positive match for that screening, and then where does it go? Do you also file suspicious activity report if there's certain source of funds that administrators identifying? So those are the key points of the bullets on the right side. In addition to that, in anticipation of maybe investment advisors subjecting to AML program, you may want to implement training program and some other reporting for your governance function. And I think what we like to either look at is if the third-party service provider is giving you the BSA AML program service, then understand and know and to be able to speak to what they're doing. If you're doing it yourself, then take into consideration what Shailene was talking about with the 6 pillars. Okay, I'm done, Rob, and then we can move on to your slide.
That's great information, Cindy. Thank you so much. Okay, all right. So then we're going to hand the baton off to Jared Barnes over at First Republic. Thank you, Jared.
Thanks, Rob. So I'm glad to see that some of you are prepared for some of these requirements. What I wanted to cover today is how the evolving compliance framework that regulators are asking banks to adhere to are going to impact your banking relationships with your financial institution. Keep in mind, every financial institution is going to have their own risk tolerance and risk framework, similar to how Cindy mentioned with your funds. You could be a solely domestic fund, or you could take international. It's going to be the tolerance that you set forward as part of your risk appetite for your institution. But as Cindy mentioned with the leaked FBI memo in 2020, that kind of kicked off compliance professionals to say, hey, wait a second, this looks like the regulators and everyone is going to start looking into this. So you saw a flurry of compliance professionals start to put in and enhance the control framework for banking alternative investments. And then with the AML Act of 2020 and how that's going to be implemented, the real impact that you're going to see is your financial institutions are really going to want more information about your limited partners. And I think from a deposits, product, and service perspective, it has historically been not common to provide that information to your financial institution. I know that in cases where you have a loan facility, you might provide that information. But what you'll start to see is institutions are going to start requiring that you have a formal AML program, that you have a designated compliance officer, money laundering officer, or BSA officer. That if you have an AML program, they may start requiring either an attestation or the program itself, because they're going to start evaluating whether you do your compliance, checks and due diligence only at onboarding, at ongoing, what lists you're screening against in your OFAC and sanction program. And the reason that they're doing this is because kind of the way that the federal regulators work is they regulate the banks, and then the banks have to kind of regulate their clients and work with their clients to make sure they have the right controls in place so that it meets the bank's risk framework. And so, I saw there was a question saying like, why do private funds have to have this? It's not necessarily that private funds are going to be required under the law, but the banking institutions are going to be required to implement controls and evaluate this, which is then going to make and pass that burden on to the firms to make sure they have the right controls to understand their LPs, know the source of funds for their LPs, and know the beneficial owners. I know several compliance professionals across the industry that are actually starting to implement policies around identifying the UBO of LPs from Cayman, Cyprus, Panama, and places like that, where previously they had just have asked where your countries of expected investors are coming from. Now they're actually going to dig down and deeper into that to really understand the source of the funding. Using today's geopolitical events as an example, if you were to bring on a new fund, for example, your institution may want to know if you have any Russian oligarchs as LPs. The reason being is, sanctions are coming out weekly or several times a week at this point. And so your institution is going to look at that to try and evaluate what that potential impact is going to be to them if, this party potentially gets sanctioned, in the coming weeks or months. And so the relationship between, alternative investment firms and the banks are really going to start to have to, build a lot of synergy with the compliance programs because of the way that federal regulators and law are being implemented. So, overall, that's really the biggest impact you're going to see from this is that you're going to start to have a more robust relationship with your financial institutions compliance program and enter into, an information sharing, whether it's at onboarding or it's going to be ongoing monitoring or assessments that the bank is doing, where they're inquiring with you about your LPs or your investments and getting more due diligence around that source of funding. I'll pause for there, Robin.
And just continuing with that, Jared, I think it's important to note that, and thank you for kind of elaborating on that. It's just that as you're doing your alternative investments, or as they're doing their AML and KYC review, it's going to be essential that sometimes, especially if they're applying for a line of credit, or that they're trying to create a new account for a new fund that they're launching, that the banks may then, because of the changes that are coming forth, as you stated, are going to be looking for them to be able to provide that additional information, or that layer of information, because transparency becomes the key. The banks have to make sure that they understand at every level and every stage who they are contracting business with. And it just doesn't stop with the fund manager. It also includes who the fund managers are also doing business with. And so the collection of that information and providing that information becomes something more critical with these changes with the AML KYC, the AML Act of 2020, because previously, that transparency may have stopped at the investment manager level. It is no longer going to stop at the investment management level, because that Corporate Transparency Act is making sure that they're able to see through every layer of the relationship that the financial institutions have. And likewise, just with, as everyone said, that they may not have been, or 50% they say that they may not have been aware of the AML Act changes. A lot of times, when we are looking at changes from AML and regulatory guidelines, it seems to be normally the standard that as an unregulated industry, that the application of these changes does not impact us. Unfortunately, and just keeping with the spirit of the law, it does. Because while there is no mandate that you necessarily implement these programs, if indeed you are transacting with a particular investor or a relationship that is then sanctioned, there is no protection for your investment, for your firm, or for your assets. So it's important that you implement best practice, that you're thinking about this holistically and not just simply regulatory. If you're banking on your regulatory requirements, you may find yourself exposed and falling short in being able to protect your assets and protect your investors. And so it's in thinking of these changes as they're occurring with the AML Act of 2020 is not simply, okay, am I obligated to make a change? It's whether or not the spirit of the law, whether the interpretation of the law and my social and moral obligation with the law provides that I implement changes or implement a program to be able to be proactive in managing and fighting money laundering activities and making sure that I have a good, sound KYC program. So, that's another impact to the, to fund managers that we need to think of that's just beyond just the regulatory impact of the law itself.
That's great, Charlene. Thank you.